about the wind wasn't just weird. It was a lie designed to get me killed. When I took the night watchman job at the desert aircraft Boneyard, I thought I was signing up for the easiest paycheck of my life. It was just me, a beat-up patrol truck and 4,000 dead military planes rusting under the Nevada moon. The silence out there was heavy, the kind that rings in your ears. My supervisor, a grumpy old veteran named Russo, gave me the orientation on my first night. We were standing at the edge of Sector 9, the most remote part of the graveyard, where the massive B-52 bombers sat in endless, skeletal rows. "Listen up, kid," Russo had grumbled, spitting tobacco onto the dusty ground. "This sector is strictly observe and report. You don't get out of the truck. And most importantly, if you hear metal screeching against metal out here, ignore it. It's just the desert wind vibrating the loose parts on the old fuselages. It plays tricks on your ears. Don't go investigating noises." It sounded reasonable enough at the time. These planes had been sitting in the sun for decades. Things were bound to creak. For the first 3 weeks, I followed the rules. I drove the perimeter fence, listened to static on the radio, and fought to stay awake. It was boring, lonely work. The rows of giant aircraft looked like sleeping dinosaurs made of aluminum and steel. Sometimes, when the wind picked up, I did hear sounds that made my skin crawl, low groans and high-pitched squeals that echoed through the metal canyons. I always gripped the steering wheel tighter and told myself it was just the weather. But boredom does stupid things to a man. On the Tuesday of my 4th week, the silence was getting to me. The air was dead still. Not a breath of wind disturbed the sagebrush. I was parked near the center of Sector 9, staring at the cockpit of an old cargo jet when I heard it. Screeching. It was loud, sharp, and incredibly violent. It didn't sound like wind vibrating a loose panel. It sounded like a massive steel girder being dragged across concrete. It came from deeper in the sector, near the red zone, where the planes were still classified. My heart hammered against my ribs. According to Russo's logic, there should be no noise tonight because there was no wind. Curiosity got the better of my fear. I put the truck in gear and slowly rolled toward the sound, turning off my headlights so I wouldn't spook any potential copper thieves. I let the truck glide to a stop near a massive C-130 Hercules transport plane. It was sitting apart from the others, isolated in a wide clearing. I killed the engine and stepped out into the cool desert night. The silence had returned, thicker than before. I clicked on my heavy-duty flashlight and swept the beam over the plane. That's when I saw it, and the first cold spike of genuine terror hit my stomach. The massive cargo ramp at the back of the plane wasn't just open. It was destroyed. The thick metal skin of the aircraft was peeled outward like the lid of a sardine can. The jagged edges of the torn aluminum were bent away from the inside of the hold. Nothing human could have done that. No thief with a crowbar could generate that kind of force. It looked like an explosion had gone off inside, but there were no scorch marks. I should have gotten back in the truck. I should have called Russo, but I was hypnotized by the impossible sight. I walked up the bent ramp, my boots crunching on debris. The air inside the cavernous hold was stale and hot, smelling intensely of old hydraulic fluid, rotting canvas, and something else, something musky and wild, like a wet dog wrapped in dirty copper. I swung my flashlight beam around the empty darkness. Heavy tie-down chains hung limply from the ceiling, their thick steel links snapped cleanly in half. In the center of the floor was a bolted-down metal pallet where a large container had once sat. The container was gone, but a plastic clipboard was lying near the anchor points. I picked it up, blowing off a thick layer of dust. The paper was yellowed and brittle. It was a military transport manifest dated 20 years ago. I scanned the faded type. The flight origin was a place called Site Omega. The cargo was listed simply as Asset 4 Biological Containment Unit. There were warnings printed in red ink at the bottom. Do not open under any circumstances. Extreme hostility. The officer who signed off on it was a Major Sterling. My hands started shaking. This plane wasn't here to be scrapped. It was a cage that something had broken out of. Russo had lied. The noise wasn't the wind. It was the sound of something massive sharpening its claws on the aluminum graveyard it now called home. I dropped the clipboard and turned to run back to the truck. Screeching. The sound ripped through the silence again, but this time it wasn't distant. It came from directly above my head. The roof of the C-130 buckled inward with a deafening crunch. Dust rained down on me. I froze, shining my light toward the ceiling. I saw 4 massive depressions forming in the metal skin of the aircraft, like giant fingers pressing down from the outside. Something enormous was on top of the plane. Then the screeching stopped, replaced by a low, rattling growl that vibrated in my own chest. I heard heavy, padded footsteps moving across the roof, heading toward the open tail ramp, my only exit. I was trapped in the belly of the beast's metal den, and it was coming inside. I made a terrible mistake coming out here, but you need to know the truth about what they're hiding in this desert. You need to hear the recording I found in the cockpit before that thing tears me apart. But before I tell you what happened in that cockpit, listen to me. If you want to survive the things that go bump in the night, and you want to be the first to hear these classified files before they get scrubbed from the internet, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. Join the channel. Do it now, because once I start this recording, there is no turning back. I didn't think, I just reacted. The heavy thud of the creature landing on the rear ramp shook the entire plane, vibrating through the soles of my boots. I knew if I turned around to look at it, I would die. My only chance was the darkness at the front of the cargo hold. I sprinted toward the cockpit, my feet pounding against the metal floor, praying the noise of my own running was masked by the groaning of the fuselage. The air inside the plane felt suffocating, hot and thick with that metallic, musky stench. I reached the bulkhead that separated the cargo area from the flight deck. There was a narrow ladder leading up to the pilot's cabin. I scrambled up it, my hands slipping on the dusty rungs, barking my shins against the steel. I threw myself onto the upper deck and crawled behind the navigator's station, curling into a tight ball in the shadows. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would crack my ribs. I pressed my hand over my mouth to stifle my breathing, listening with every ounce of focus I had left. Below me in the main cargo hold, the silence stretched out for a terrifying second. Then I heard it. Click, click, click. It was the sound of hard claws tapping on the aluminum floor. It was moving slowly, deliberately. It wasn't rushing. It knew I was here, or at least it knew something new had entered its territory. I risked a glance through the small gap in the metal grating of the floor. A beam of moonlight was cutting through the open ramp at the back, illuminating a strip of the cargo bay. A shadow passed through the light. It was massive. At first, my brain refused to make sense of what I was seeing. It walked on 2 legs, but its posture was hunched and predatory. It was easily 7 feet tall. But it was the skin that made me want to vomit. It wasn't covered in a thick coat of fur like a normal animal. It looked diseased. The fur was patchy and gray, falling out in clumps to reveal skin that looked like callous leather, thick, scarred, and armored. It looked like a wolf that had evolved to survive in a junkyard. Its shoulders were broad and powerful, and its arms hung low, ending in hands that looked disturbingly human, but tipped with hooked black claws the length of steak knives. The creature stopped in the middle of the hold, right where I had been standing moments ago. It raised its head and sniffed the air. Its snout was long and scarred, and I saw its ears swivel toward the ladder. They were huge, tattered things that rotated independently, like radar dishes. It was listening for my heartbeat. I squeezed my eyes shut, terrified that even the sound of my eyelids blinking would give me away. The creature let out a low, chattering sound like rocks grinding together in a mixer. It began to pace. Thump, thump, thump. It was circling the pallet where the clipboard had been. It was agitated. I needed a weapon. I needed a way out. The cockpit windows were too high off the ground to jump without breaking a leg, and the side emergency door was likely fused shut by 20 years of desert heat. I looked around the cramped flight deck. The pilot's and co-pilot's seats were shredded, the foam padding rot away to reveal rusty springs. The instrument panels were smashed, stripped of any valuable copper wiring long ago. My hand brushed against something hard wedged between the pilot's seat and the center console. It was a heavy metal lockbox, the kind used for classified documents. The lock was busted, likely pried open by whoever had looted the plane years ago. I slowly, silently lifted the lid. Inside, there was no money or secret weapon. There was just a small, violently scribbled notebook and a handheld radio that looked like a brick. I picked up the notebook. The cover was stained with something dark and brown that looked uncomfortably like old blood. I tilted it toward the moonlight filtering in through the dusty windshield to read the first page. The handwriting was jagged, written by a hand that had been shaking uncontrollably. November 12, 2005. They aren't dead. We were told the transport was for disposal of biological waste from Site Omega. They lied. The sedative wore off an hour into the flight. Asset 4 woke up. It ate Miller. It ate him while he was screaming and the bullets didn't do a thing. We are putting the bird down in the desert. We can't let this thing reach a populated area. If anyone finds this, do not open the hold. Burn the plane. Burn it all. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. This creature had been here for 20 years. It had survived the crash. It had survived the heat. And the government, the people in charge of this boneyard, knew it. They hadn't cleared this sector because they were keeping it as a cage. Russo's rule about the wind, it was to keep people away, to keep us from investigating the sounds of the monster feeding or sharpening its claws. A loud clang from below snapped me back to reality. The creature had knocked over a loose metal panel. It was getting impatient. I heard it sniff loudly again, a wet, snorting sound. Then the footsteps changed direction. They weren't packing in circles anymore. Thump, thumpy, thumpy. They were getting louder. They were moving toward the front of the plane, toward the ladder. My blood ran cold. It had picked up my scent. I looked around desperately for anything to use. I grabbed a heavy, rusted fire extinguisher from beneath the navigator's table. It was empty, but it was a solid chunk of steel. I gripped it with both hands, my knuckles white. The ladder creaked. The entire plane seemed to shift slightly as the massive weight of the beast pulled itself up the first rung. I heard the rasp of its claws gripping the metal steps. It was coming up. I was trapped in a dead-end aluminum box with a monster that had eaten an entire flight crew, and my only weapon was a piece of rusty junk. I backed up as far as I could, pressing my spine against the instrument panel. I watched the dark square of the hatch in the floor. A gray, clawed hand reached up and gripped the edge of the opening. The metal groaned under the pressure. Then, the head rose into view. Yellow eyes, bright with a sickening, intelligent hunger, locked onto mine in the darkness. It didn't roar. It didn't growl. It pulled its lips back in a mockery of a grin, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth, and made that clicking sound again. It had found me. I didn't wait for it to finish climbing into the cockpit. The second those yellow eyes locked onto me, I swung the rusty fire extinguisher with every ounce of hysterical strength I possessed. I aimed directly for that nightmare face. The heavy steel tank connected with a sickening crunch against the creature's snout. It felt like hitting a brick wall wrapped in wet leather. The impact didn't kill it, but it did surprise it. The beast's head snapped back, and a spray of dark, black blood splattered against the instrument panel. It let out a sound that I will never forget, not a roar, but a high-pitched, surprised yelp that sounded disturbingly like a hurt man. Its grip on the floor hatch slipped, and it slid backward down the ladder, crashing onto the metal deck of the cargo hold below with a heavy thud. I knew I had about 5 seconds before it came back up, and this time it wouldn't be curious. It would be furious. I dropped the extinguisher and spun toward the side window of the cockpit. It was a sliding glass panel, clouded with age and grit. I fumbled with the latch, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely grip the metal. It was stuck. The desert heat had fused the mechanism shut years ago. From below, I heard a scrabbling sound, claws tearing into metal. It wasn't using the ladder anymore. It was climbing the walls. "Come on," I screamed, slamming the heel of my boot against the glass. The window shattered outward on the second kick, raining shards down onto the desert floor below. I didn't look down to see how far the drop was. I just shoved my upper body through the jagged frame, scraping my chest on the broken glass, and threw myself into the empty air. Gravity took over. I flailed in the darkness for a terrifying second before the ground rushed up to meet me. I hit the hard-packed sand feet first. A sharp, hot pain shot up my right leg as my ankle twisted, and I collapsed into a roll, gasping for breath. The fall had knocked the wind out of me, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins forced me to scramble back up. I limped as fast as I could toward my patrol truck. It was parked about 50 yards away, a small white island of safety in a sea of darkness. The silence of the boneyard was gone now. Behind me, from inside the C-130, came a roar that shook the ground. It was a deep, oscillating howl that started low and climbed to a shriek, echoing off the aluminum skins of the surrounding plains. It was a calling card. It was letting me know the hunt was on. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The creature had emerged from the top of the fuselage again, pulling itself through the hole it had made earlier. It stood on top of the cockpit, silhouetted against the moon. It looked massive, a dark gargoyle perched on the dead machine. It didn't jump down immediately. It just watched me limping across the open ground, its yellow eyes glowing like dying embers. It knew I was hurt. It knew I wasn't fast. I reached the truck and fumbled for my keys. My hands were slick with sweat and blood from the scrapes on my chest. I jammed the key into the door lock and twisted. The lock clicked. I threw the door open and dived inside, slamming it shut and locking it in one fluid motion. "Start, please start," I begged, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life. I slapped the gear stick into drive and floored the gas pedal. The tires spun in the loose sand for a second before gripping, and the truck fishtailed forward, kicking up a cloud of dust. I didn't turn on the headlights. I didn't want to show it where I was going. I just drove by moonlight, weaving between the rows of B-52 bombers, heading for the main gate of Sector 9. I checked the rearview mirror. Nothing. Just the empty desert and the dark shapes of the plains. I let out a shaky breath, wiping the sweat from my eyes. I reached for the radio on the dashboard to call Russo. I needed to tell him. I needed to scream at him for sending me out here to die. But before I could grab the mic, the truck violently shuddered. The roof buckled inward with a deafening metallic bang, right above the passenger seat. The glass of the windshield spiderwebbed instantly. It hadn't stayed behind. It had followed me. It had moved silently through the shadows, leaping from plane to plane, keeping pace with the truck, and now it was on top of the cab. A claw, thick and black, punched through the metal roof like it was made of paper. It slashed blindly into the cab, missing my face by inches. The smell of musk and rot filled the small space instantly. I screamed and swerved the truck hard to the left, trying to shake the thing off. The vehicle tipped dangerously on two wheels before slamming back down. The creature held on. Another claw punched through, this time ripping out the dome light and grabbing the headrest of the passenger seat. It shredded the fabric, sending foam flying everywhere. It was trying to peel the roof off like it had peeled the cargo plane. I saw a gap between two massive cargo planes ahead, a narrow alleyway of metal. If I could scrape the creature off, it was my only chance. I lined up the truck, gritting my teeth, and accelerated. The gap was tight, too tight. "Get off," I yelled, bracing myself for the impact. I drove the passenger side of the truck into the fuselage of a rusted bomber. The sound was ear-splitting, metal screaming against metal. Glass shattering, and a wet, heavy thump as the creature was crushed between the truck and the plane. The impact spun the truck around, shattering the side window and throwing me against the door. The truck stalled and died. Steam hissed from the crushed radiator. The silence returned, sudden and absolute. I sat there dazed, blood trickling down my forehead. I looked out the broken passenger window. There was a smear of black slime on the side of the bomber and a deep dent in the fuselage, but the creature was gone. I wasn't foolish enough to think it was dead. I had just bought myself a few seconds. I grabbed the heavy flashlight from the seat next to me and the stolen notebook from my pocket. I kicked my door open and stumbled out into the maze of planes. The truck was totaled. I was on foot, miles from the main gate, with a twisted ankle and a monster that knew my scent. I limped into the shadow of a massive wing, trying to control my breathing. That's when I saw the sign on the chain-link fence ahead of me. I had crashed near the perimeter of the red zone. The area Russo had said was strictly off-limits, even for guards. The fence was torn open. Not recently. It had been torn open a long time ago. And beyond the fence, half buried in the sand, wasn't a plane. It was a concrete bunker, its blast doors slightly ajar. The same symbol from the clipboard, the Omega symbol, was painted on the steel in fading red paint. I realized then that the C-130 hadn't just crashed here by accident. It was delivering something to home base. I wasn't just in a graveyard. I was standing in the driveway of the kennel. I stared at that dark, gaping mouth of the concrete bunker. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run the other way. The air wafting out of those slightly open blast doors was cold, unnatural, and carried that same rotten copper stench I'd smelled in the cargo plane, but concentrated 100 times over. This wasn't a shelter for me. It was a shelter for them. If I went in there, I'd be walking straight onto their dinner plate. I turned my back on the bunker and the torn fence. My ankle throbbed with every heartbeat, sending hot spikes of pain up my leg, but I forced myself to move. I needed high ground. I needed a place with a working phone or a radio that could reach the outside world, not just the local base frequency. About a half-mile away, rising above the sea of skeletal tail fins, was the old control tower. It was a jagged silhouette against the stars, its glass windows long blown out, but it was solid concrete. If I could get up there, maybe I could barricade the door. Maybe I could survive until morning. I kept to the shadows, hugging the fuselages of the dead bombers. The boneyard was a maze of metal. Cables hung from stripped wings like nooses, and loose panels groaned in the breeze. I was jumpy, my head snapping toward every sound. I clutched the heavy flashlight in one hand and the stolen brick-sized radio in the other. I hadn't turned the radio on yet, afraid the static would give away my position, but I was desperate. I crouched beneath the landing gear of a B-52, the tires as tall as I was, and decided to risk it. I turned the volume dial on the radio down to the lowest whisper and clicked it on. Static hissed softly. I slowly turned the frequency dial, scanning through the channels. Nothing. Nothing. Then a voice cut through the white noise. It was clear, calm, and terrifyingly familiar. Subject is mobile in Sector 9. Vehicle is disabled near the red zone perimeter. It was Russo, my supervisor, the man who had hired me, who had told me about the wind. He wasn't sounding the alarm. He sounded like a scientist observing a lab rat. Another voice replied, deeper and distorted. "Copy that, Watchtower. What is the status of Asset 4? "Asset 4 is engaging," Russo replied. "Vital signs are elevated. It's enjoying the hunt. Do you want me to deploy the containment team yet?" "Negative," the deep voice said. "Let the test run its course. We need to see if the asset can navigate the maze to catch a target that is actively evading. We need data on its problem-solving skills. The guard is expendable. Record everything." I almost dropped the radio. The cold realization washed over me, numbing me more than the desert night ever could. There was no copper theft ring. There was no security job. I was meat. I was a toy thrown into the arena to see how fast the monster could solve the puzzle of killing me. The rules, the isolation, the lies about the wind. It was all a setup to keep me here until they were ready to let the dog out. I felt a sudden, burning rage that momentarily eclipsed my fear. I wasn't going to die for their data. I wasn't going to let Russo watch me get torn apart on some grainy monitor. I clipped the radio to my belt and scrambled out from under the plane. I wasn't just running away anymore, I was running with a purpose. I moved faster, ignoring the agony in my ankle. I had to get to the tower, not just to hide, but because that's where Russo had to be. He said watchtower. He was watching me from high up. I covered ground quickly, limping in a jagged rhythm. I was about 200 yards from the base of the tower when the environment changed. The planes here were arranged differently. They weren't in neat rows anymore. They were pushed together nose to tail, forming a solid wall of aluminum. It was a funnel, a chute. I stopped. The path ahead was wide and clear, leading straight to the tower, but the sides were blocked by the wall of planes. It felt wrong. It felt too easy. I looked down at the sand. In the moonlight, I saw drag marks, not mechanical ones, but deep furrows, as if heavy objects had been pulled into place. They had built this. They had arranged the planes to force me down this specific path. Then came the sound. Clicking. It didn't come from behind me. It came from the left, from atop the wall of planes. Clicking. Another one from the right. I spun around, shining my flashlight up at the wings of the bombers forming the walls of the chute. On the left, perched on a B-52 wing, was the creature I had hit with the fire extinguisher. Its snout was matted with dried blood, and it was snarling silently. But it wasn't alone. On the right, standing on top of a cargo transport, was another one. This one was slightly smaller, its fur a pale, dusty brown that blended perfectly with the desert. Its eyes glowed with the same bioluminescent yellow. There wasn't just one. There was a pack, and they weren't attacking. They were waiting. They were positioned on the high ground, looking down at me like gargoyles. They had herded me here. They had let me run, let me think I was escaping, just to funnel me into this kill box right in front of the tower. I looked up at the dark glass of the control tower looming above. I saw a faint flicker of movement in the window, the glow of a cigarette or a monitor screen. Russo was up there. He had a front row seat. The pale creature on the right let out a sound that chilled my blood. It wasn't a growl. It was a mimicry. "Help me," it rasped. The voice was distorted, guttural, and wrong, but the words were clear. It was mimicking a human voice. It sounded like a recording of a man screaming in pain, played back on a broken tape deck. "Help me." It was mocking me, or maybe it was luring me. The larger, dark creature on the left dropped from the wing. It landed on the sand with a heavy thud, blocking the path back the way I came. It stood up to its full height, towering over me, blocking the moon. It extended its claws, flexing them slowly. I was cut off. The path forward led to the tower, but the door at the base was likely locked, and I'd be exposed in the open for the final 50 yards. The path back was blocked by the Alpha. The sides were walls of steel. I gripped the flashlight like a club, though I knew it was useless against two of them. I looked at the dark creature, then at the pale one, and then at the tower. I had seconds to make a choice. If I stayed here, I died. If I ran for the tower, I probably died. But then I remembered the C-130. I remembered the cargo hold. These creatures were strong, but they were big. They needed space. I looked at the wall of planes to my right. There was a small gap where the wing of a fighter jet was wedged under the fuselage of a transport. It was a tiny, triangular opening, barely big enough for a man to crawl through. A dog the size of a horse couldn't fit. I didn't hesitate. I threw the heavy flashlight at the pale creature on the right to distract it and dove into the dirt. I scrambled on my belly, dragging my bad leg, and squeezed into the gap under the planes just as the dark Alpha lunged. I felt the wind of its claws swipe past my boot, slicing through the rubber sole but missing the flesh. I kicked frantically, pushing myself deeper into the crawl space beneath the crushed metal. The space was tight, smelling of oil and rats. I could hear them outside, roaring in frustration, their claws tearing at the aluminum skin of the planes, trying to dig me out. I was under the mountain of junk now. I was in the veins of the boneyard, and for the first time since I found that manifest, I had gone off script. Russo couldn't see me down here. I pulled out the radio again. If Russo was listening, I had a message for him. "I know you're watching, Russo," I whispered into the mic, my voice shaking with rage. "And I'm coming up there, but I'm not coming alone." The darkness under the mountain of planes was almost absolute. The only light came from thin, jagged slivers of moonlight filtering down through the cracks where the wings and fuselages overlapped. The air was suffocating, thick with the smell of 20-year-old oil and the dry, dusty scent of rat droppings. I lay flat on my stomach, my face pressed into the cold sand, listening to the nightmare unfolding just 10 feet behind me. The sound of the creatures tearing at the plane I had just squeezed under was deafening. It sounded like a car crusher at work. Metal shrieked and popped as they ripped sheets of aluminum away, trying to widen the gap. They were digging for me. I could hear their wet, heavy breathing, a frustrated chuffing sound that vibrated through the ground and into my chest. They knew exactly where I was, but for now, the tangled mess of the boneyard was my shield. I couldn't stay there. Eventually, they would tear enough of the plane away to reach me, or they would find another way in. I keyed the radio off to save the battery and to stop the faint green glow of the screen from giving me away. I had to move by feel. I reached out with my left hand, my fingers brushing against sharp rivets and tangled wires, and pulled myself forward. My ankle was a throbbing ball of fire, dragging uselessly behind me like a dead weight. Every inch was a battle. I gritted my teeth to keep from crying out, forcing myself to crawl deeper into the labyrinth. I was moving blindly through the guts of the aircraft graveyard. Above me were B-52 bombers, C-130 transports, and fighter jets, all crushed together into a chaotic ceiling of steel. It was a claustrophobic nightmare, but it was the only place those massive things couldn't follow. I crawled for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only 10 minutes. The sounds of destruction behind me faded, replaced by a terrifying new sound. Thump, thump, ping. It was coming from directly above my head. I froze, holding my breath until my lungs burned. The sound moved. Thump, ping. Something heavy was walking on top of the wings I was crawling under. Dust and rust flakes rained down onto my neck. They hadn't given up. They had split up. One was probably still digging, but the other, the smart one, the alpha, was tracking me from above. It was listening to my movements through the metal, waiting for a gap large enough to reach down and snatch me. I forced myself to keep moving, slower this time, timing my crawls with the wind that was starting to pick up outside. I needed a destination. I couldn't just crawl in circles until I died of dehydration. I thought about the tower, the cables. Russo had monitors. He had power. That meant there had to be lines running from the cameras in the boneyard back to the tower. If I could find the main conduit, I could follow it to the source. I swept my hand across the sandy ground, feeling for anything unnatural. Sand, rock, metal, scrap. Then rubber. A thick bundle of rubber-coated cables about as wide as my arm, snake-like and partially buried in the dirt. I traced them. They ran straight through the darkness, cutting under the fuselages. I followed the lifeline. The crawl space got tighter. At one point, I had to exhale all the air from my lungs to squeeze under the collapsed landing gear of a jet. The heavy tire pressed against my back, and panic flared in my chest. I felt like the weight of the entire world was crushing me. But I pushed through, scraping the skin off my shoulders, and popped out into a slightly larger space. The cables led to a concrete wall. It was the foundation of the control tower. I had made it to the base. I fumbled in the dark, running my hands along the cold concrete. The cables disappeared into a rusted metal grate set into the wall. It was a maintenance access point, maybe for electrical repairs or ventilation. It was small, but the grate was old. I hooked my fingers into the mesh and pulled. It held fast. Above me, the walking stopped. I heard a low, chattering growl right through the aluminum ceiling. The creature was directly overhead. It knew I had stopped. I heard the scrape of claws testing the metal, looking for a weak point. I didn't have time to be gentle. I grabbed a loose piece of heavy rebar lying in the sand and jammed it into the side of the grate. I leveraged it with everything I had. The rusted bolt screeched in protest. Snap! The grate popped loose, swinging inward on one hinge. The noise was loud, too loud. Instantly, the metal ceiling above me exploded downward. A massive, clawed hand punched through the fuselage of the plane I was hiding under, missing my head by inches. The force of the blow threw sand into my eyes. I didn't look back. I threw my backpack into the hole and shimmied through the grate, tumbling onto a cold concrete floor. I kicked the grate back into place and jammed the rebar through the mesh to wedge it shut, just as the creature tore the entire wing off the plane outside. A yellow eye pressed against the grate, staring at me from the darkness of the crawlspace. It snarled, a sound of pure hate, and slammed its shoulder against the wall. Dust fell from the ceiling, but the concrete held. It couldn't get in. Not this way. I rolled onto my back, gasping for air, clutching my chest. I was safe for the moment. I clicked the radio back on for a split second to check the time. 3:00 a.m. I had survived 3 hours. I looked around. I was in the sub-basement of the tower. It was a small room filled with humming electrical boxes and thick bundles of wires running up into the ceiling. In the corner, a metal ladder led up to a trapdoor. I dragged myself over to the ladder. My ankle was swollen to the size of a grapefruit, but the adrenaline was acting as a powerful painkiller. I climbed slowly, one rung at a time, listening. The trapdoor at the top was unlatched. I pushed it open an inch and peeked through. I was in a supply closet. I could see mops, buckets, and shelves of cleaning supplies. Light spilled in from under the door. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't over the radio this time. It was real, close, and coming from the other side of the door. "Efficiency is down," Russo was saying. "The subject has gone underground. The assets are frustrated. We might lose visual." "Flush him out," a deeper voice replied. "Release the gas into the tunnels. If he dies from the toxins, the assets can still feed on the carcass. We need to test their scavenging instincts anyway." My blood boiled. They were going to gas me like a bug. I carefully lowered the trapdoor, stepping off the ladder and into the closet. I stood up, leaning against the mop sink to take the weight off my leg. I pulled the radio from my belt. I wasn't going to hide anymore. I was inside their fortress. I turned the volume all the way up. I pressed the transmit button. "You don't need gas, Russo," I said, my voice echoing slightly from the radio in his hand in the other room. "I'm already here." I heard a chair scrape against the floor in the next room. Silence followed. I gripped the heavy rebar I had brought with me. I wasn't the prey anymore. I was the one holding the door handle. The silence in the control room was heavier than the humid air in the supply closet. I gripped the cold, rusted steel of the rebar until my knuckles turned white. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my mind was strangely clear. I had played their game, run their maze, and now I was done running. I was the glitch in their system. I didn't wait for them to come to me. I kicked the door open with my good leg, the wood splintering around the lock. I stumbled into the room, raising the rebar like a baseball bat. Russo dropped the radio. It clattered onto the linoleum floor. He spun around in his chair, his eyes wide, his face draining of color. He looked smaller than I remembered, stripped of his authority now that I was standing 5 feet away with a metal bar. Standing next to him was a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, wearing a crisp gray suit that looked ridiculous in the middle of a dirty desert boneyard. He didn't flinch. He didn't look scared. He just looked at me with cold, dead eyes, like I was a spreadsheet error he needed to delete. "Don't move," I rasped, limping forward. I positioned myself between them and the heavy steel door that led to the exit stairs. "Give me the keys to the Jeep outside, Russo, now." Russo's hands were shaking as he reached toward his belt. Kid, you don't understand. You can't just leave. The protocol. Shut up about the protocol, I screamed, swinging the rebar so it smashed into a row of filing cabinets. The loud clang made Russo jump. I heard you. I heard you talking about gassing me. I know what's in those planes. I know what you're selling. The man in the suit spoke up. His voice was smooth, deep, and devoid of any human warmth. You don't know anything, Mr. Evans. You think you've stumbled onto a secret. This isn't a secret. It's a marketplace. He gestured calmly to the wall of monitors behind him. I risked a quick glance. The screens showed different angles of the boneyard in grainy green night vision, but they weren't just showing empty plains. They were showing the creatures. There were 3 of them now. The dark alpha, the pale one, and a third, smaller one I hadn't seen before. They weren't hunting me anymore. They were standing at the base of the tower looking up. Their eyes glowed like radioactive fireflies on the screens. We aren't testing them for science, the suit continued, adjusting his cuffs. We're demonstrating them for buyers, field capabilities, tracking skills, durability. You provided an excellent unplanned variable tonight. The buyers are very impressed with Asset 4's persistence. You're sick, I spat, taking a step toward him. Call them off, or I swear I'll crack your skull open. The suit smiled, a thin, cruel curving of his lips. I can't call them off. That's the selling point. Once they lock onto a target, they don't stop until the target is terminated. That's what makes them the perfect biological weapon. And right now, you are the only target they care about. He reached out and pressed a large red button on the console. I tensed, expecting an alarm, but nothing happened inside the room. Instead, on the monitors, I saw the floodlights around the base of the tower snap off. I just cut the perimeter inhibitors, the suit said calmly. They can climb now. Russo panicked. He scrambled out of his chair. Sir, the glass isn't rated for. Quiet, Russo, the suit snapped. From below us, a sound vibrated through the concrete floor. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was the sound of claws digging into the cement, finding purchase in the cracks. They were scaling the tower. They were coming up the outside. I looked at the massive observation windows that lined the front of the room. They offered a panoramic view of the boneyard, but right now they looked terrifyingly fragile. They were just glass. Old, sun-baked glass. We're 3 stories up, I said, my voice trembling. They can't climb sheer concrete. They are genetic hybrids of wolf and primate DNA recovered from Site Omega, the suit said, sounding like a museum tour guide explaining a display. They have opposable thumbs and claws that can puncture steel. Concrete is nothing to them. A shadow rose up outside the window. It happened in slow motion. One moment the window was a black square reflecting the room lights. The next, a monstrous gray hand slapped against the glass. The palm was flat, the fingers long and spindly, spreading out like a spider. The yellow eyes rose into view, staring directly into the control room. It was the Alpha. It was hanging off the side of the tower with one arm looking in at us. It saw me. It saw Russo. It saw the suit. It didn't care about the difference. It reared back its free hand and hammered its fist against the window. THOOM. The glass bowed inward. A spiderweb crack appeared in the center. Russo screamed and fumbled for the pistol on his hip. I didn't wait. I lunged at the suit, swinging the rebar. He was fast, dodging to the side, but the metal bar caught him on the shoulder. He grunted and stumbled back against the console. Widened. Pieces of glass tinkled onto the floor. The creature roared, a muffled, vibrating sound that shook the fillings in my teeth. Shoot it, I yelled at Russo. Shoot it. Russo raised his gun, his hands shaking so hard he could barely aim. He fired 3 shots wildly. Bang, bang, bang. One bullet hit the ceiling, one hit the console, sparking a shower of wires, and the third hit the window, but not the creature. It just shattered more of the glass. The window gave way. With a crash that sounded like a bomb going off, The entire pane of glass exploded inward. The desert wind howled into the room, carrying the stench of rot and musk. The Alpha vaulted through the broken frame, landing on the linoleum in a crouch. It was huge, taking up half the room, its chest heaving. Russo turned to run for the door, abandoning me. The creature moved with a speed that blurred the air. It didn't go for me. It went for the movement. It lunged across the room, tackling Russo before he could touch the handle. I didn't watch what happened next. I scrambled backward, putting the heavy metal command console between me and the beast. The suit was on the floor, clutching his shoulder, his face pale but still calculating. "The stairs," I gasped, looking at the open door Russo had failed to reach. The creature was occupied. This was my only chance. I looked at the suit. "Move and you die." I grabbed the ring of keys Russo had dropped when he was tackled and bolted for the door. I could hear the wet, tearing sounds behind me and the deep, satisfied growls of the Alpha. But as I reached the stairwell, I heard another sound from the window. Another hand gripped the ledge. The second one was coming in. The control room wasn't a shelter anymore. It was a feeding trough. I slammed the heavy steel door behind me and locked it, leaving the suit and the monsters trapped together in the dark. I started hopping down the stairs, 3 at a time, praying the Jeep outside had gas. The echoes of the screams from the control room were muffled by the heavy steel door, but I could still feel them vibrating through the soles of my boots. I didn't stop to listen. I gripped the railing of the stairwell and threw myself down the concrete steps, taking them 3 at a time. My bad ankle screamed in protest, sending jolts of white-hot agony up my leg with every impact, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins was a powerful drug. I was running on pure survival instinct now. I spiraled down into the darkness of the tower's core, my hands sliding along the cold, rough wall for balance. Somewhere above me, glass shattered again, followed by a heavy thud that shook the entire structure. The Alpha hadn't stayed in the room. It had finished with Russo and the suit, and now it was coming back for the main course. I burst out of the ground floor exit and into the cool night air. The wind hit my sweaty face like a slap. I scanned the area wildly, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Russo's Jeep, a modified lifted Wrangler used for desert patrol, was parked 10 yards away near a stack of rusted fuel drums. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I limped toward it, fumbling with the keys I had stolen. The metal clicked against the door, scratching the paint, until finally the key slid home. I yanked the door open and threw myself into the driver's seat. It smelled like stale coffee and Russo's cheap cologne, the smell of a man who was probably being torn apart right now. I jammed the key into the ignition and twisted. The engine roared to life, a guttural mechanical growl that sounded like hope. I slammed the shifter into drive and stomped on the gas pedal. The tires spun in the loose gravel, kicking up a storm of dust before finding traction. The Jeep shot forward, fishtailing as I fought to keep it straight. I flipped on the high beams. 2 cones of bright white light stabbed into the darkness of the Boneyard. And they illuminated a nightmare. Standing directly in the middle of the only dirt road leading to the main gate was the pale one, the second creature. It hadn't gone up the tower with the Alpha. It had stayed down here. It knew I would come down. It wasn't hunting, it was goaltending. The creature stood on 2 legs, its light brown fur blending with the desert dust. It raised a hand to shield its sensitive eyes from the headlights, squinting at me with a look that was terrifyingly human. It didn't move to attack. It just stood there, blocking the path, daring me to come closer. "Move or die," I gritted out through clenched teeth. I didn't hit the brakes. I floored it. The engine whined as the speedometer climbed, 30, 40, 50 miles per hour. I gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather creaked. I was going to turn this genetically engineered monster into roadkill. At the last possible second, just as the grill of the Jeep was about to impact its knees, the pale one moved. It didn't jump away in fear. It sidestepped with a fluid, unnatural grace, dropping to all fours. As I flew past, I felt a massive impact on the rear passenger side. The Jeep shuddered violently, nearly tipping over. I looked in the side mirror. The creature had swiped at the rear tire, its claws sparking against the rim. It was running now. It was chasing the car, and it was gaining. I swerved around the wing of a C-130, drifting in the sand, and gunned it down the long straightaway toward the main perimeter gate. The boneyard was a blur of gray metal and black shadows. I checked the mirror again. The pale one was galloping on all fours, its spine flexing like a cheetah, closing the distance. It was packing the car at 45 miles per hour. "Come on, come on," I yelled at the dashboard, pushing the pedal to the floor. The main gate loomed ahead in the darkness. It was a heavy chain-link barrier topped with razor wire, reinforced with steel bars. Usually it was electronic, operated by a remote in the Jeep. I grabbed the remote, clipped to the sun visor, and mashed the button. Nothing happened. The red light on the remote didn't blink. The suit, when he cut the inhibitors at the tower, he must have killed the power to the entire sector grid to let the monsters roam free. The gate was dead. It was a wall of steel, and I was hurtling toward it at 60 miles per hour. I had a split-second choice. Slam on the brakes and get eaten by the thing chasing me, or ram the gate and pray the heavy bull bar on the front of the Jeep could break the chain. I chose the ram. I braced myself, locking my arms against the steering wheel, and aimed for the center seam of the gate. But I never made impact. A massive dark shape dropped from the sky. It landed on the hood of the Jeep with the force of a falling boulder. The windshield shattered instantly, showering me with safety glass. The hood buckled inward, steam hissing from the crushed radiator. It was the Alpha. It had jumped from the tower or from the top of a plane, timing its descent perfectly. It was crouched on the crushed hood, staring at me through the broken windshield, its face inches from mine. Its muzzle was wet with fresh blood, Russo's blood. I slammed on the brakes instinctively. The Jeep skidded, sliding sideways in the sand, tires screaming. The Alpha dug its claws into the metal hood to anchor itself. It raised a fist and punched through the remaining glass, grabbing the steering wheel and ripping it out of my hands. The Jeep spun out of control, slamming broadside into a concrete barrier post next to the gate. The impact threw me against the door, my head cracking against the window. The world went fuzzy and gray for a second. The engine stalled. The headlights flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I sat there dazed, blood running into my eyes. I could hear the radiator hissing. I could hear the wind. And then I heard the sound of a door being ripped off its hinges. The driver's side door was torn away like cardboard. I looked up, blinking through the blood. The Alpha was standing over me, blocking the stars. It reached in, grabbed me by the tactical vest I was wearing, and dragged me out of the wreckage like a rag doll. It threw me onto the sand. I tried to crawl, but my body refused to obey. I rolled onto my back, looking up. The Alpha stood over me, chest heaving. The pale one trotted up behind it, chattering excitedly. They had me. The game was over. The maze was solved. But they didn't kill me. Not yet. The Alpha leaned down, its hot breath washing over my face. It sniffed me, then looked toward the gate. It let out a low, commanding bark. The pale one moved to the gate. It grabbed the chain link with its fingers, its human-like fingers, and began to climb. It wasn't trying to escape. It was checking the perimeter. The Alpha looked back at me. It wasn't just an animal. The intelligence in those yellow eyes was cold, calculating, and military. It grabbed my ankle, the broken one, and began to drag me back toward the boneyard, away from the gate. They weren't done playing. Or maybe they weren't done feeding. They were taking me back to the nest. The desert floor was endless. That's all I knew for what felt like an eternity. The sand was like coarse sandpaper, grinding the skin off my back and arms as the Alpha dragged me by my shattered ankle. Every bump, every rock, every patch of sagebrush sent a jolt of nausea-inducing pain up my leg. I wanted to scream, to beg, but the wind had been knocked out of me in the crash, and my throat was too dry to make a sound. I just stared up at the indifferent stars, watching them bounce and blur as I was hauled toward my death. The creature didn't tire. It didn't pause for breath. It moved with the steady, hydraulic power of a machine. I could hear the pale one trotting behind us, making those soft, clicking sounds. A conversation I couldn't understand, but one that sounded disturbingly like excitement. We passed the wreckage of my patrol truck, then the crushed remains of the Jeep at the gate. We were heading deep into the red zone. The air grew colder as we approached the torn fence. The smell hit me again, that concentrated stench of old blood, copper, and wet musk. We were going back to the bunker. The Alpha dragged me through the gap in the chain-link fence, the metal tearing at my uniform, and down the concrete ramp into the black maw of the earth. Inside, the darkness was absolute. The temperature dropped 20 degrees instantly. The sound of the wind died away, replaced by the dripping of water and the echo of the creature's breathing. The Alpha didn't slow down. It pulled me through a long, damp corridor, its claws clicking on the concrete floor. Finally, it swung me around like a sack of garbage and released my leg. I slid across the slick floor, slamming into a wall. The impact knocked the last of the air from my lungs. I lay there in the dark, gasping, waiting for the killing bite. I waited for the teeth to close around my throat. But nothing happened. I heard the Alpha grunt, a low, satisfied sound. Then I heard footsteps walking away. The heavy steel door of the room slammed shut with a boom that vibrated in my chest. Then the grinding sound of a heavy lock sliding into place. They hadn't brought me here to eat me, not yet. They had put me in the pantry. I lay in the silence for a long time, trying to slow my heart rate. The pain in my ankle was a dull, throbbing roar now. I reached down and touched it. It was swollen and hot, but the boot had kept the bones from protruding. I forced myself to sit up. I had to know what kind of hell I was in. I patted my pockets. The heavy flashlight was gone, lost in the crash. The radio was gone. But in my back pocket, I felt the small, rectangular shape of a cheap plastic lighter I kept for emergencies. My hands shook as I flicked the wheel. A tiny, yellow flame sputtered to life. It cast a weak, dancing light, illuminating only a few feet in front of me. I held it up, squinting into the gloom. I was in a cell. It looked like an old storage room for munitions. The walls were thick concrete, lined with empty metal shelves. The floor was stained with dark, ancient fluids, but I wasn't alone. In the corner, slumped against a stack of rotting wooden crates, was a figure. I scrambled backward, nearly dropping the lighter. "Who's there?" I croaked. The figure didn't move. I crawled closer, holding the flame out. It was a man in a torn security uniform. It was Russo. He was a mess. His shirt was shredded and his face was pale and waxy. He was clutching his side, his breathing shallow and wet. The Alpha must have dragged him here after the attack in the tower, moving incredibly fast while I was running down the stairs. "Russo," I whispered, reaching out to shake his shoulder. His eyes fluttered open. They were glassy and unfocused. He looked at me, then at the lighter, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Kid," he wheezed, you drive like a maniac." "Save it," I hissed, looking at the door. "How do we get out of here? Is there a back exit?" Russo coughed, a wet, hacking sound that brought up blood. He shook his head weakly. "No exit, this is the feeding room. They bring the live ones here, keep them fresh." "Why?" I asked, my anger flaring up again. "Why are you doing this? What is this place?" "Money," Russo whispered, closing his eyes. "The suit. He sells them. Private armies, dictators, they pay millions for a weapon that hunts on its own. We just keep the inventory." "Well, your inventory is about to kill us," I said. "Where is the suit? Is he here?" "Dead," Russo mumbled, "head ripped off in the tower." So it was just us. A dying old man and a crippled guard, trapped in a concrete box with monsters outside. I looked around the room, desperate for anything. The wooden crates Russo was leaning against were stamped with the same military markings as the C-130. "What's in the crates, Russo?" I asked. Flares." He stammered, "emergency signaling, huge ones for the runway." My heart skipped a beat. Runway flares. Those weren't little roadside candles. Those were magnesium-burning torches designed to be seen from 30,000 feet. They burned at thousands of degrees. They didn't just make light, they made fire. I dragged myself over to the crates. The wood was rotten. I smashed my elbow into the lid, splintering it. Inside, packed in straw, were metal tubes the size of baseball bats. I grabbed one. It was heavy. "Russo," I said, turning back to him, "do you still have your gun?" Russo patted his empty holster. "Gone," dropped it. I cursed. A flare was a distraction, maybe a weapon if I got close enough, but it wouldn't kill them. I needed something more. I looked at the lighter in my hand, then at the flare, then at the straw in the crate. Then I saw it. Leaking from a rusted pipe in the ceiling, pooling in the corner of the room, was a black, viscous puddle. It smelled like dinosaur bones. Old diesel fuel from the bunker's generator system. An idea formed in my mind. It was a stupid, suicidal idea, but it was the only one I had. "Russo," I said, gripping his shoulder, "can you walk?" "No," he whispered, "leave me." "I'm not leaving you to be dog food," I said. "Listen to me. They're going to come back for us. When they open that door, I'm going to light this whole room up. I need you to be ready to crawl." Russo looked at me, his eyes clearing for a second. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver keycard. The armory," he gasped. "Level 2 if you get past them. Get to the armory." I took the card. It was heavy, cold, and stained with his blood. "Okay," I said, "level 2. I crawled to the fuel puddle. I took off my uniform shirt, wincing as the movement pulled at my cuts. I soaked the heavy fabric in the diesel until it was black and dripping. I stuffed the soaked shirt into the crate with the remaining flares. I was building a bomb, a magnesium and diesel firebomb right at the entrance of the pantry. I sat back against the wall, the heavy flare tube in my lap, the lighter in my hand. I stared at the steel door. "Come on," I whispered into the dark. "Come and get it." As if on cue, the heavy lock on the door clicked. The handle turned. They were back for seconds. The heavy steel wheel of the blast door turned with a groan of rusted metal that echoed like a scream in the small room. I watched it rotate. 1 turn, 2 turns, my thumb hovering over the striker of the cheap plastic lighter. Beside me, Russo had passed out again, his breathing ragged and wet, but I didn't have time to worry about him. All my focus was on that door and the monstrosities waiting on the other side. The door swung inward. The smell hit me first, that overpowering musk of wet fur and raw meat. Then came the silhouette. The Alpha filled the doorway, its massive frame blocking out the dim light from the corridor. It didn't rush in this time. It stood there, sniffing the air. It smelled the diesel. It smelled the trap. Its yellow eyes locked onto me, sitting in the dark with the unlit flare in my lap. It let out a low, rumbling chuff that sounded almost like laughter. It knew I was cornered. It took a step inside, its claws clicking on the concrete. The pale one peeked over its shoulder, chattering excitedly. "Dinner is served," I whispered. I flicked the lighter. The flame caught instantly. I touched it to the diesel-soaked shirt stuffed into the crate of magnesium flares. For a second, nothing happened. Then the fuel caught with a whoosh, and the heat ignited the magnesium. The room didn't just light up. It turned into the surface of the sun. A blinding, brilliant white light exploded from the crate, so intense it seared my retinas even through my squeezed-shut eyelids. The heat was instantaneous and blistering. The Alpha screamed. It wasn't a roar of anger. It was a shriek of pure, sensory overload. These creatures had evolved for the dark. They lived in bunkers and nighttime boneyards. Their eyes were sensitive enough to see heat signatures. I had just set off a supernova in their face. I grabbed Russo by the back of his belt and dragged him, scuttling backward like a crab as the magnesium sparks showered the room. The alpha was thrashing blindly in the doorway, clawing at its own face, swiping wildly at the air. The pale one had vanished, likely scrambling back down the hall in terror. "Move, Russo," I yelled, though I couldn't hear my own voice over the roaring of the fire. I grabbed the heavy flare tube I had kept for myself, a striker-activated one, and slammed the ignition cap against the floor. It hissed to life, spewing a jet of red flame and thick white smoke. I held it out like a spear, aiming it at the thrashing shadow in the doorway. The alpha lunged blindly, guided by sound. Its claw clipped my shoulder, spinning me around, but I thrust the burning flare right into its chest. The fur caught fire instantly. The smell of burning hair mixed with the chemical smoke. The creature howled again and stumbled back into the corridor, retreating from the pain and the light. This was my chance. I hauled Russo up. He was dead weight, his feet dragging, but adrenaline gave me the strength of 10 men. I dragged him through the door, stepping over the burning puddle of diesel and into the corridor. The smoke was thick, filling the tunnel, blinding the monsters as much as it blinded me. "Level 2, I coughed, eyes streaming. "Where is the armory?" Russo pointed vaguely down the hall to the right. "Stairs, down." We stumbled down the corridor. I could hear the alpha behind us, roaring in pain and rage, slamming its body against the walls as it tried to orient itself. It wouldn't be blind forever. We had seconds. We reached the stairwell door. It was locked. I fumbled for the bloody keycard Russo had given me, my hands shaking so bad I dropped it. It clattered onto the concrete. No, no, no. I fell to my knees, groping in the smoke. A heavy weight slammed into the wall 10 feet behind us. A growl, deep and vibrating, cut through the smoke. It had found us. My fingers brushed the plastic card. I snatched it up and swiped it through the reader. The light turned green. The lock clicked. I threw the door open and dragged Russo through, slamming it shut just as a massive impact dented the steel from the other side. A claw punched through the metal, the tip gleaming inches from my nose before withdrawing. I locked the deadbolt. We were in the stairwell. It was cool and quiet here. I slumped against the door, gasping for air. Russo slid down to the floor, his face gray. You crazy bastard," he wheezed, a faint smile on his bloodied lips. "We're not done yet," I said, checking the flare. It was sputtering, dying out. I dropped it and looked down the stairs. "Armory, we need guns." I hauled him up again. We descended the stairs to level 2. The air here was stale and dry. At the bottom, another heavy door waited. I swiped the card. The door hissed open, revealing a room that looked like heaven. It was the security armory. Rows of lockers lined the walls. On the rack in the center sat black, beautiful assault rifles. I let Russo slide to the floor and limped over to the rack. I grabbed an M4 carbine, checking the action. It was clean, oiled, and loaded. I grabbed extra magazines and stuffed them into my pockets. I grabbed a shotgun for Russo, though I didn't know if he could even lift it. "Russo," I said, turning back to him, "we have the firepower now. We can hold the stairwell." Russo didn't answer. His head was slumped on his chest. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. His chest was still. I froze. I dropped the rifle to its sling and knelt beside him, checking for a pulse. His skin was already cooling. The internal bleeding from the crash and the monster's attack had finally caught up with him. He was gone. I sat there for a moment, the silence of the armory pressing in on me. I was alone again. Just me, a dead man, and a backpack full of ammo. A loud clang from the ventilation duct above my head made me jump. I looked up. The grate was screwed shut, but something was moving inside the shaft, something heavy. They weren't trying to break down the stairwell door anymore. They were coming through the vents. I stood up, gripping the rifle. My sadness for Russo vanished, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't going to die here. I wasn't going to be inventory. I looked at the wall map mounted next to the gun rack. It showed the layout of the bunker. There was a secondary exit, an emergency ventilation shaft that led to the surface, located at the far end of level 2. But to get there, I had to go through the containment lab. I racked the charging handle of the rifle. "All right," I said to the empty room. "Let's finish the test." I stepped out of the armory and into the dark hallway of level 2, raising the weapon. The vent above me burst open and the pale one dropped to the floor, snarling. I didn't hesitate. I pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked against my shoulder, the sound of the shots deafening in the confined concrete hallway. I didn't aim, I just sprayed lead. The pale one caught midair as it dropped from the vent, twisted violently as the bullets shredded its chest. It hit the ground with a wet slap, sliding to my feet, its yellow eyes dimming as it clawed weakly at the floor. I didn't stop to check if it was dead. I put 2 more rounds into its skull just to be sure. The echo of the gunfire died away, replaced by a new sound. From down the hall, coming from the direction of the armory, I heard a roar that shook the dust from the ceiling. The Alpha. The fire hadn't killed it. It was burnt, it was blind, and it was coming. I turned and sprinted toward the containment lab. My ankle was numb now, the pain buried under a mountain of adrenaline. I swiped Russo's bloody keycard through the reader at the end of the hall. The door hissed open, and I stumbled into a room that looked like the inside of a madman's nightmare. The lab was lined with massive glass tubes filled with green, bubbling fluid. Floating inside them were things, failures, twisted lumps of flesh that looked half human, half wolf. Some had too many eyes, some had no mouths. This was where they made them. This was the factory. I ran past the tanks toward the emergency ladder at the far wall. I was halfway there when the door behind me exploded inward. The Alpha didn't use a keycard. It used its shoulder. It burst into the room, a smoking, blackened ruin of a monster. Its fur was gone, its skin blistered and raw from the magnesium fire. One of its eyes was melted shut, but the other one, that glowing, hateful yellow orb, locked onto me instantly. It let out a shriek that shattered the glass of the nearest tank, spilling preservation fluid and a malformed fetus onto the floor. It charged. I raised the rifle and pulled the trigger. Click. Jammed. I threw the useless weapon at its face and scrambled backward, slipping on the slick fluid covering the floor. The Alpha swiped at me, its claws tearing through the tactical vest I was wearing, raking across my chest. I screamed and fell back against a control console. The creature loomed over me, raising both hands for the killing blow. My hand brushed against a heavy lever on the console. It was marked with black and yellow stripes, cryogenic purge. I didn't know what it did. I didn't care. I yanked the lever down with both hands. A siren blared. From the ceiling vents directly above the creature, a thick white fog blasted down with the force of a jet engine. It was liquid nitrogen. The Alpha roared, but the sound was cut short as the freezing gas enveloped it. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly. I rolled away, shielding my face as the monster froze mid-scream. Its blistered skin cracked and hardened, turning into a statue of gray ice. I didn't wait to see if it would thaw. I scrambled up the emergency ladder, my frozen fingers gripping the rungs. I climbed until my muscles burned, until I saw a circle of light above me. I punched the hatch open and dragged myself out onto the desert floor. I was outside the fence. The sun was just starting to crest over the mountains, painting the boneyard in blood-red light. The silence of the desert had returned. The wind was still. I limped for miles. I didn't look back at the bunker. I didn't look back at the plains. I reached the highway by noon, flagging down a confused trucker who looked at my torn uniform and bloodied face with horror. I told him I'd been in a hiking accident. He didn't ask questions. He just drove. I spent the next week in a cheap motel 3 states away, waiting for the black SUVs to show up. waiting for the bullet in the back of the head, but nobody came. The news reported a gas explosion at an old military disposal site in Nevada. They said no one was injured. They said the site was secure. I thought I had escaped. I thought I had beaten them. Yesterday, I logged into my bank account to withdraw the last of my savings so I could disappear for good. I froze. The balance wasn't $300 anymore. It was $5 million. There was a memo attached to the deposit. It didn't say hush money. It didn't say settlement. It read field test complete. Subject Evans. Rating superior. Welcome to the program, handler. I stared at the screen, the cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The suit in the tower hadn't been the boss. Russ wasn't the supervisor. I wasn't the guard. I was the rat in the maze. They weren't testing the monsters to see if they could kill me. They were testing me to see if I could kill them. I looked down at my phone. A text message popped up from a blocked number. Report to Site Omega for your next shift. Do not be late. We have a new litter that needs training. I looked at the bag of money, then at the door. I wasn't a victim. I was an employee. And God help me, I was packing my bags, because now I knew the truth. The monsters aren't the ones in the cages. The monsters are the ones signing the checks, and I just cashed mine.